and 2 p.m. I see by my thing. So I think it's okay to get this show on the road. Bob?
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to Skewed History, how American history textbooks skew the past. I am Bob Paquette, President and Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, an educational nonprofit located in New York. I will be serving as the moderator of today's webinar. Allow me at the outset to thank Peter Wood and the National Association of Scholars for organizing this event. Skewed History and our history instructional materials and support project has also been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. A distinguished group of scholars have gathered for the webinar to present their findings. Theodore Rebarber has played a vital role in this history initiative. Ted is the Chief Executive Officer of American Achievement Testing, AAT, an education nonprofit located in Washington, D.C. He has been involved in educational reform for more than 30 years, including opposing the Common Core standards. Recently, he founded AAT, a co-recipient of the grant that funded today's report. AAT's role in this project is to develop a high school history curriculum that uses historian Wilfred McClay's fine textbook, Land of Hope, and here it is, as well as the founding documents and other original sources to offer students an accurate account of the great American story. Ted, can you say a few words about the project?
Sure, thank you, Bob. I'm going to be very brief because our part in this project is going to come to fruition later this summer. But I do want to mention that at the White House U.S. History Conference last September, where this grant was announced, I was on a panel and we all remarked on the increasing division in our society, and I noted the AP U.S. History framework distorted history to an incredible degree. The references to property were generally negative, a distorted historical sense of our Judeo-Christian heritage, and in many other ways. And I noted that this certainly didn't help and probably contributed to the increasing division in our society and the loss of the sense of the meaning of the American founding. And I think the report, the very fine report that NAS has put together with a number of you and other scholars reviewing the textbooks has only reinforced that notion that the history we're teaching our students is severely distorted, skewed, you might say. And our role in this is not so much working on this report, but we are developing an option for those who would rather have an unskewed or an accurate history for our students. And we are working with historian McClay and the author of that fine textbook on a full history curriculum, with the first few units to be released later this summer. And so I'm eager to listen to this, to the accounts of the textbook reviews, but the preliminary copy I've seen certainly reinforces my view that an alternative is needed. And those who want more information on what AAT is doing can visit our website, aateducation.org. That's aateducation.org, and there's also a place to contact us. So with that, I'll just listen now. Thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you so much, Ted. The justification for today's webinar is, simply put, that this country needs better American history textbooks. American children are growing up to know little about the story of their nation's failures and successes. At a time when America is wrestling with its past on so many fronts, it is imperative that students learn a history that is fair-minded, fact-based, and not subject to ideological bias. History books, from which many children are taught, should be well-written to make students interested in American history. We can and must do better. Our reporters will review and critique the coverage by 5 textbooks of 4 historical periods: the European settlement of North America, Colonial America, the nation's founding, and the New Deal. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes to report. Let me introduce the reporters. First, David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars, composed Skewed History, the title of this review. He will be followed by Kevin Gutzman, who is Professor of History at Western Connecticut State University. Then by Bruce Froenen, Professor of Law at Pettit College of Law, Ohio Northern University. Then Jason Ross, Associate Professor and Associate Dean of the Helms School of Government at Liberty University. And then finally, as a team, Amity Shlaes, Chair of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, and William Pettinger, Research Associate at the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. These scholars will not only critique the textbooks, but offer recommendations on how to better educate students, young and old, in American history, a subject, I might add, that is no longer required these days of history majors at many of this country's elite colleges and universities. The current situation recalls one of my favorite history quotes, and here it is. Most modern people appear to resent the past and seek to deny its substance for either of 2 reasons. 1, it confuses them, or 2, it inhibits them. If it confuses them, they have not thought enough about it. If it inhibits them, we should look with a curious eye upon whatever schemes they have afoot, unquote. We have gathered here today to clarify and assist in thinking about American history. Also with us as commenters are Jamie Gass, Director of the Center for School Reform at the Pioneer Institute, Catherine Gorka, Director of the Fulner Institute Center for Civil Society and the American Dialogue, the Heritage Foundation, and finally, Stanley Kurtz, Senior Fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Each of our commenters will have 10 minutes each to speak. Those who have unanswered questions at the end of the webinar are encouraged to contact David Randall at randall@nas.com. I repeat, randall@nas.com, and he will see that your questions are directed to the right person. David Randall will start the formal presentations with an introduction. David, can you get us going?
Thank you. I should just say that, by the way, randall@nas.org. I wish I were for profit, but no, sadly, no. So, look, so I don't want to say too much, which would repeat what the other historians have to say. And in effect, my entire introduction was done with that in mind. Briefly, what is wrong with these textbooks? And this is me summing up some of the other critiques as well as my own. Format. The basic history textbooks suffer from distracting graphics, and they too often lapse into a list of topics demanded by education bureaucrats. Yet students are not provided a coherent narrative. There's also a progressive skew in the content, particularly in the advanced textbooks, where the history is presented to favor both progressive politics and the progressive interpretation of history. And most notably, and I'll get into this, there's an awful lot of identity politics and the cant of diversity. Religion. The textbooks minimize or erase religion, especially Protestantism, from American history. And where they do mention it, they frequently fail to provide a proper explanation of what precisely is going on. Political theory. The textbooks tend to narrow political theory to a cramped left Enlightenment mold in 18th century America and an equally cramped yet left liberal mold in 1930s America. Economics, this goes with it. The textbooks tend to articulate liberal economic presumptions, very notably as regards the New Deal, but also as regards colonial America. And then character instruction. The textbooks no longer seek to provide character instruction, to educate our children to become virtuous citizens who cherish and will fight for liberty. And the absence is most apparent in their treatment of the American Revolution, where there is usually a vestigial recitation of some of the facts that used to be provided for that purpose, but they rarely recollect the reason why such facts were taught in the first place. There's an awful lot more to be said, and you'll hear it from the other scholars. I just want to focus briefly on how the textbooks distort history to conform to the modern cant of diversity, which they use as a euphemism. For example, non-white Americans are labeled as diverse. The textbook American History has a section titled "Diverse Writers Depict American Life." It means non-white. In some part, the textbooks use diversity to disguise a failure of description and analysis. In colonial America, the middle colonies are always diverse. They have a greater ethnic and religious diversity. Unfinished Nation states that the arrival of whites in Spain's American Empire launched a process of interaction between diverse peoples that left no one unchanged, which is an absolutely meaningless sentence. Diversity and difference characterized individual colonies. This is intellectual laziness rather than sophistication. It's just a nullity, not a historical analysis. Then you have diversity cited with unthinking approval. America's History talks about Native American diversity and complexity as a section title. United States History provides diversity in New Netherlands thrives. Only rarely do they make even a stab at a rational argument for why this might be good. United States History states that settlers in New Jersey were allowed religious freedom, which helped attract an ethnically diverse population and fostered tolerance. It also then says that the diversity of the middle colonies violated the traditional belief that political order depended on ethnic and religious uniformity. But it doesn't mention why that traditional belief existed, for which there's good reason to think that there's a trouble with diversity. Not least, Europe had these terrible wars of religion, 1618 to 1648, the 30 Years' War. England itself suffered from the civil wars, 1642 to 1651. Throughout history, the fault lines of tribe and nation have precipitated an extraordinary amount of violence, everywhere in the world. There were reasons that they had these beliefs. And then none of the textbooks even consider whether Massachusetts and Virginia had primacy in colonial and revolutionary America, not least because they had greater ethnic and religious uniformity among the white population. America's History, which I must say is my favorite among the 5 books, is the only one that suggests that diversity might not have been an unalloyed good. They have a quotation. In the 1740s in Pennsylvania, the flood of new migrants reduced Quakers to a minority. In New York, a Dutchman declared that he valued English law no more than a turd. That's a wonderful quote. And then America's History even mentions how economic elites use diversity to secure their interests and how diversity erases cultural heritage. White planters welcomed ethnic diversity to deter slave revolts. African ethnic identity fell into disuse on culturally diverse plantations. And that's the only textbook that provides even a hint by which you might critique the modern corporate diversity regime. And then they never consider the claim, which has been asserted most forcefully by Christopher Caldwell, that in human history, diversity usually means fatal weakness. Caldwell puts it wonderfully. The Indians had diversity. That meant some fought with King Philip in his war, and others fought against him. The Christians among them were an important source of intelligence to the English. War split up not just families, but among the tribal leaders, marriages. King Philip was driven eastward, back across Massachusetts to his homeland and his fate. when the America's history lauds Native American diversity complexity, it doesn't consider the Caldwellian argument that this was a gift from an evil fairy. And contrary-wise, when it covers New Deal America, it takes the time to differentiate the history of Mexican Americans and Indians. Only United States History, that textbook, touches on how the New Deal annealed Southern and Eastern European immigrants into the American nation by way of shared loyalty and affection for unions, government programs, and the Democratic Party. There's generally this distortion in all the textbooks of all of American history by an endless moralizing emphasis on diversity and this silence about the cohering forces that united the American people. So a great deal more to say about the textbooks, both by way of criticism and of praise. And I should say that I do believe the textbook's shortcomings require a substantial correction. Much of what they do is adequate, if marred by politicizations such as their distorting fealty to diversity ideology. Yet, we should aspire to better than adequate. These textbooks can be made much better, and they should be. America should expect excellent history textbooks. And that's where I'm ending.
Thank you, David. All right, Kevin? Kevin Gutzman?
Yes, thank you. Since ancient times, historiography has served numerous purposes. Besides for sheer entertainment, people have looked to the example of great warriors and statesmen of the past for inspiration and for lessons both philosophical and practical. They have also considered the factors that have led to success or failure in diplomacy and warfare. From the time of Eusebius, Christians have seen the divine playing out in the story of the church. By the early modern era, people began to study the personal lives and careers of great artists and scientists. In his youth, Thomas Jefferson considered the study of history a trifle. With maturity, however, he reconsidered, coming to think that historical knowledge should constitute a significant part of American Republican citizens' mental makeup. His most important reason for coming to this conclusion was that if Americans knew what past political actors had done to overturn Republican governments, they would be able to head off future attempts at overturning America's Republican governments. This would seem especially urgent to them if they were familiar with the enormous sacrifices that have been made to establish America's Republican society and state. For all these reasons, American youth need to be taught their nation's history. The more diverse their backgrounds, religions, and origins, the more imperative suitable history instruction becomes. It ought to be civic history of the kind Thomas Jefferson envisioned. Far from merely entertaining, although of course it should be entertaining, it ought to be inspirational. It must also make clear to students how rare republicanism has been, how much republicanism in the world owes to the American example and America's influence, and how short-lived republics have tended to be. This requires that students learn from able, dedicated teachers. Those teachers must be prepared through education, not only in American history and government, but also in the history of Western civilization. Foremost among the tools history teachers will need are appropriate, attractive, inspirational textbooks. The portions of these 5 books with which I've been concerned cover the era 1492 to 1660, the period from Columbus's first transatlantic voyage to the Stuart Restoration. In general, to significantly varying degrees, I find that these books miss the mark. Let me explain. First, in order to understand American government and society today, people need to understand English come British government and society in the 17th century. That should start with a brief account of the history of Christianity, its Jewish background, the life of Jesus, formation of the church, 4th century Christianization, the Reformation's progress on Great Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries, European geography. One could hope then that their textbook would feature good maps of the United Kingdom, relevant parts of Western Europe, and the East Coast of North America. Here I take exception to the Atlantic world approach of some of these 5 books, which devote substantial space to, inter alia, contemporaneous African kingdoms that drop out of the story as soon as they're described, and prehistoric settlement of North America by people who crossed the Bering Strait numerous millennia ago. Far more important, I think, are that Sir Walter Raleigh's initial attempt at North American colonization on behalf of his English queen be described, and that the earliest years of the Jamestown settlement and the fledgling colony of Virginia be chronicled. John Smith, Powhatan, John Rolfe, Pocahontas, George Casson, the Church of England, tobacco, indentured servants, the entire enterprise should be described. Difficulties, suffering, lessons, triumphs, all ought to be explained. Where there were failures, those too should be discussed. Negative features of the story should not be omitted or even downplayed, but if they were virtually universal features of human existence at the time, that fact should be noted. And it's true of all these books that they omit blame colonial Anglophones for not allowing women to vote. Asked where women were voting in 1619, a question that has never occurred to them, they become perplexed. Of course, the same kind of questioning can be used to prompt them to think more historically about slavery and the framer of the United States Constitution, all of which is also unfamiliar to them. And I don't think they'd learn that from these textbooks. Ronald Reagan liked to tell a story of the boy who went into a stable and began furiously digging, then responded to the question why by saying, "There must be a pony in here somewhere." That was Reagan-esque optimism, which the president went far toward making American optimism. My impression is that many of our young people are now being taught in American high schools, partly by text early in a course. Historians know that as Sir Walter Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth understood, Portugal and Spain had claimed gigantic tracts of highly productive land in the Americas by the time England decided to get into the colonial game, and that they had turned the best of its slave-based sugar cultivation. This involved huge forces of bondmen. Mainly for geographic reasons, the English colonies north of Florida never developed along those lines. They would have if they could have, contrary to popular myth. Puritans, for example, did not oppose slavery in the 17th century, but they did not. Students should be taught to think of geography as going far toward determining the colony's economic foci. So the water-rich low country was devoted to rice cultivation. Chesapeake Tidewater was tobacco land. Natural ports of New York and Boston were trading centers. Pennsylvania became America's industrial center because the Delaware's fall line was only 10 miles inland, which ruled out focusing the colony's economic activity on production of a staple crop, and so on. Each of these colonies would have copied the model of San Domingue or Brazil or Barbados if it could have, but none of them could exactly. Economic activity sprang up to a large degree in response to economic incentives. People might murmur that slavery on Barbados was particularly brutal, general religious moral indictment of slavery. This is the context in which I think the colonies should be placed in order to make North American slavery comprehensible. It was not a freestanding institution dreamed up by malicious Europeans perversely content to exploit Africans. Rather, it was a feature of the New World economy transported from West Africa to the Western Hemisphere by Iberians and adopted on a far smaller scale by Anglophones without colonial governments giving it much thought. Here I would include an account of the Virginia legal case Johnson versus Casser, which is absent from all of these texts. Meanwhile, New England's first two colonies should be treated as what they were, religious missions. The material about Christian history to which students have already been exposed by this point should have prepared, that is, in an ideal textbook, should have prepared them to understand both the separating separatists and the non-separating separatists, as Perry Miller called them, and what they meant to accomplish by coming to the New World. Unlike the typical text, I would not devote substantial attention to the Salem witchcraft scare, which is an oddity of isolated importance that appears in all these books, totally predictably. I think it's a curiosity, but not much more. Instead, the Plymouth Pilgrims' mission and experience, including William Bradford's account of their experiment with communal landholding, should be recounted. John Winthrop and Roger Williams are the major figures in Massachusetts Bay Colony, New England history in this period, and I would focus on their visions for their new communities. Winthrop's City on a Hill speech is mentioned in part in passing in these books. There's no explanation where he got the metaphor. There's no explanation what it meant in its original context or why he was telling the Puritans that they were going to be a city on a hill, that the eyes of all people were upon them. There's In other words, there's not really any explanation of what he was saying in making this address. There's certainly more than enough food for thought here to keep high school kids busy for weeks. Bradford, Winthrop, Williams all wrote interestingly and accessibly. Why not let them speak for themselves? And Bradstreet's poetry remains striking too. It is, of course, true that no two experts or authors will tell a story the same way. I think, however, that some of the flaws in these books reflect more than simple personal choices. They need to be corrected. I've tried to say how I think that might be done. I've appreciated this opportunity to do so.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Now we have Bruce Froenen.
Thanks, Bob. It's great to be here with you all. I want to thank Bob for all the important work you've been doing on history, and also the National Association of Scholars. It's particularly important given what's really taken place, not just with the study of history, but the effects of this over the last several decades, which has really, to my view, flattened out not just particular understandings of American history, but really the American character itself. We're living in the midst of a crumbling civilization. It's crumbling because of its own conduct, as is often the case. And I have to say that the teaching of history has been a central part of all this. And unlike my friend David, I can't say that I think much of the teaching that's taking place in these volumes is adequate. I think it's appalling. And he's entirely right, and being, again, a nicer person than I am, chooses to focus on their ability to give some of the fundamental facts and stories that are involved. But what really struck me on going through these volumes was a certain smugness, a sameness, and a kind of groupthink that I think is highly damaging to our students, to our children, and to the nation. If we don't engage with our story, then how are we to defend our rights, our way of life? Everything that's been said before me, I don't see any need to repeat it, about the smug view that everyone who came before us was evil in one way or another, is a way of keeping ourselves from having to study, from having to understand what came before, from having to, dare I say it, question our own motivations and what we've done. And there's nothing in any of these volumes, to my mind, that engages the imagination of students in any important fashion. The differences among these textbooks are ones of methodology and level of analysis. That is to say, there are a couple of books in this group, and anyone who wants to see these differences, you can look at the reports, and we do deal with them differently. Some of them give sophisticated arguments. Some of them are pure cookbooks with almost no story at all, almost no real content, simply providing charts and sidebars and the like. But all of them tell essentially the same story, which is of a vast time of a paradise that is then spoiled by the invasion of white devils. It's not helpful. And it doesn't give the people who are here now the means that are necessary to understand what they need to correct as well as what they need to value. This is a debilitating ideology that's being pushed onto our young people. And it's already had a significant effect on the character of Americans. I was asked in particular to look at the colonial era, around 1660 till the end of the 7 Years' War, 1763. And this is an era of extreme importance, although you wouldn't know it from its treatment in any of these textbooks, really. Because this is an era which is not easily caricatured, except in one element, which is this is the era of the Great Awakening and the American Enlightenment. Now, these intellectual eras, and that's how they treat the Great Awakening also, these movements are, of course, very important. The Great Awakening was the beginnings of a particularly American mode of evangelization, a particularly American form of not just religiosity, but of social cohesion. The American Enlightenment was the groundswell, the source of many of the thoughts, many of the modes of thought that affected our own constitutional founding. But they're presented in these books as an emotional outburst rooted in ignorance and superstition, Great Awakening, and a final sloughing off of the evils of superstition among the great minds who would eventually become good progressives like the textbook writers, the American Enlightenment. Both of those are entirely skewed and overlook the manner in which the two actually worked together quite well among many Americans during this era. Because, of course, the American Enlightenment was not one of Rousseau and the encyclopedists. The American Enlightenment was a common sense enlightenment. Although, again, one would hardly know it from reading any of these textbooks. It was deistic, not atheistic. It was entirely consistent with the kind of somewhat individualistic religiosity that one found in much of the Great Awakening. But it's not just in these two grand movements that the colonial era matters to the development of America. Kevin Gutzman pointed out some of what I want to talk about in terms of the understanding of colonial community developments. But the era of 1660 to 1763 was one of the development of American communities and the development of the interaction among these communities through a very specific formula, which dealt with diversity and unity both. But it was a diversity that is not the ideological plaything that we witness in any of these textbooks. And the unity was not the ideological utopia which these editors seem to be calling for. This was an era in which the common law was developing in a radically local fashion. People did not talk about the common law of the American colonies. They would talk about the common law of Berkshire County because it was rooted very much in local customs. The religious communities that were very real, very religious and very tight-knit, did not suddenly explode at some point on account of the American Enlightenment, and they did not become something different. Instead, what happened was they learned to cooperate where necessary. In order to understand the way that the colonies came together to fight the British in the American Revolution, you have to understand the federal thinking that is deeply embedded in the American character, which is one in which communities maintained their own independent, authentic self-government while learning to cooperate, often through explicitly federal constitutional organizations such as that in Connecticut, and often through much looser, very often religious agreements, the forms of covenantal churches and so on, and joining together in synods. This was translated into political activity. And it was a kind of political activity that recognized the very real, shall we say, diversity, if you want to say that existed among the different colonists who came from different areas of England and Great Britain more generally, and also came from other countries, but who did not suddenly and magically become a diverse community in America. In some areas, trading cities in particular, they would in fact mesh because they were concentrated on being merchants. In many areas, they in fact maintained their own, usually religious, but not always, but their own communities, who then, through an entrepreneurial spirit that was thrust upon them because of the dangers of Indians, of nature, of isolation, learned how to grow, to expand, and to join where necessary with other communities. And it's this capacity for differing groups to maintain their own self-governance and their own character, yet joined together in important projects that serve a common good, that defined what would become the United States up until quite recently, up until it has been pretty much destroyed by a centralizing tendency, which is frankly simply an assumption of the good presented by the authors of these textbooks. So I think it's highly unfortunate that there is such a groupthink about what diversity is and about the good and the evil of America, with, of course, religion being on the bad side, secularism being the good side, the side of progress. All those things we know and have learned to expect from these books. But it's the presumptions that I find most troubling, because there's an assumption that good people are, even in this era, globalizing secularists. And this is something that has clearly affected the students who are now our young adults, who I see even in the trade school that I teach at. It has stuck with them and sunk its way deeply into their character, which leads to the final thing that I really do feel the need to mention, and why I
highlight every possible identity group in every historical era. Every lesson about what they should take away from America's history. Instead, the moral of the story almost seems to have been, some people did some things. We'll leave it to you as students to figure out who did what to whom. The second group that these textbooks seem to have been written for is other historians. This was especially the case with the books targeted at advanced placement audiences. These missed the mark, I thought, in asking students to engage in the kinds of analysis that professional historians might, but that students simply don't have the knowledge to do well. So what's the message that students get from textbooks written like these? In the former case, the textbook is a digest of facts and anecdotes relating to various identity groups. They're presented from no particular point of view other than that implied by the assumptions of identity politics. These texts place the responsibility on the student to construct his or her own narrative about the meaning and significance of American history. In the latter case, the textbook trains students to approach American history as if they were historians, striving first and foremost for objectivity. These textbooks ask students to set aside any particular attachments they may have and to analyze and judge historical actors critically, according to the moral standards that we enlightened moderns now know and take for granted. In neither case is American history presented as a story of a people, of a nation to which these students might belong. Instead, in both cases, students are distanced from the story and the nation and asked to develop their own judgments of it. And it seems pretty clear that students are intended to judge our nation's founding and to find it wanting. Without exaggerating the general textbook account of the American founding too much, it begins with students being taught that after Britain's war with the French in North America, colonists began raising somewhat petty complaints about taxation. As the colonies debated with Great Britain about principles related to taxation and representation, some colonists began to appeal to Enlightenment ideals of natural rights and equality. The textbooks all point out that these ideas were crystallized by the freethinker Thomas Paine in his tract Common Sense. Paine seems to be the avatar of the textbook authors. They see themselves in him and in his revolutionary ideas, which they argue were central to the Declaration of Independence, and adapted into it. But the textbooks assert that these principles weren't truly accepted by most Americans, who denied democratic rights and equality to women and Blacks. And ultimately, the textbooks conclude that the rich white men who went to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 betrayed these Enlightenment ideals and duped the people into ratifying an undemocratic constitution. With textbooks like these, we might ask, who needs agitprop? Without exception, these textbooks miss the opportunity to tell a story of the origins, birth, and development of a distinctly American people, to which our young citizens belong and of which they can justly be proud. This nation is the product of the gradual unfolding of traditions that have proven to be robust and capable of being adopted broadly, if not applied universally, and also capable of assimilating almost anyone who chooses to adopt them. The particular origins of this national story are traceable back to religious influences at America's founding. Students get almost no sense of what it meant that Britain's North American colonies were largely settled by religious groups who dissented from the established Church of England. Most of these dissenters were Protestants who saw religious and political liberty as spiritual imperatives. Their liberty was not like the liberty that our students know, something that's exercised by private individuals, maybe in secret, maybe in shame, maybe in angry defiance to social norms. Instead, their liberty was public and communal, and they exercised it through active participation in their own governance, in their churches and in their towns. Their liberty was for something. It was for the sake of pursuing religious truth and public virtue, which they understood mutually supported one another. And though it might seem hopelessly naive to say so, this is a pursuit that may appeal to our young people if we ask them to join us in it. Without being told of the religious influences on America's national origins, students can have no sense of how the doctrines of dissenting Protestants contributed to the decision to declare independence. By the time Thomas Jefferson made the case in the Declaration of Independence that King George III was a tyrant, unfit to be the ruler of a free people, Protestants had been teaching for over 2 centuries that resistance to tyrants was obedience to God. Jefferson himself used this motto on his personal seal, and in the years leading up to the Revolution, Protestant ministers regularly preached sermons to remind their congregations of the religious and political duty to resist tyranny. A distinctly American political culture was emerging, which reflected and shaped the character of the nation that was forming. This political culture centered on the activity of self-government, which Americans were practicing in their congregations, townships, colonies, and then in their free and independent states. This attachment to self-government is evident in the story of a soldier from the Battle of Concord, who was asked to reflect on why he had fought in the American Revolution. "Were you oppressed by the Stamp Act?" he was asked. "I never saw any stamps," he answered, "and I always understood that none were ever sold." "What about the tea tax?" "I never drank a drop of tea." "Then you must have been reading Harrington, Sidney, and Locke about the eternal principles of liberty." "I never heard of them. The only books we had were the Bible, hymnals, and almanacs." "Well then, why did you fight?" He answered, "Young man, what we meant in going after those redcoats was this: we had always governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They meant to stop us." This man saw self-government as a privilege and a birthright that he and the rest of our revolutionary generation were determined not to give up. Nothing of this proud attachment to self-government is taught in the textbook version of the American founding. But shouldn't our young citizens at least be informed of their birthright to self-government and allowed to make a conscious choice as to whether to claim it or reject it? This determined defense of self-government against the threat of tyranny was reflected by and in the American habit of putting our freedoms down in writing. Again, very little is said about this in the textbooks, but students should know that by 1776, the peoples who would become American had been writing down their compacts, their covenants, their fundamental orders, their bills of rights, and their constitutions for over 150 years. Even the Declaration of Independence, which our history textbooks treat as a novel philosophical statement, was preceded by dozens of similar documents prepared by local and state assemblies, offering their own denunciations of tyranny against the British king and asserting their own defenses of their right to self-government. The Declaration of Independence was then followed by a period of constitutional development, the likes of which the world had not seen before or since. All of this should inform the textbook version of the American founding era, but doesn't. But without this foundation, students are totally unprepared to grasp this key point of American constitutionalism, that it honors our potential as saints to rise to the responsibilities of self-government, while accepting our propensity as sinners to succumb to the temptations of tyranny. This was one of James Madison's key insights in his defense of the ratification of the Constitution. Madison and his generation knew that men are not angels and that angels do not govern men. Therefore, we must establish constitutions both to control the governed and to control those who govern us. Madison and his generation also knew that governments could be weakened and even destroyed by the emergence of factions within the citizenry. Students deserve to be warned that every republic, even our own, will succumb to the violence of faction if it is left unchecked by constitutional safeguards. Madison was especially concerned by a particular kind of faction, grounded in what he called the mere distinction of color. He said this had become the ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. And he was right. Students are taught about this kind of faction, and in fact, it is almost all they are taught about in the textbook account of the American founding era. But they're not taught that slavery then was globally more the rule than the exception, and that it had been so for most of human history prior to the time of America's founding. They're not taught that in the period between the Declaration of Independence and the ratification of the Constitution, 10 states abolished the importation of slaves. They're not taught that during this period, 6 states banned slavery outright or passed gradual abolition laws, and 2 more did so shortly after the Constitution was ratified. They're not taught that the United States joined Great Britain in 1808 in being the first nations to abolish the slave trade permanently. These are some of many, many things that students deserve to be told about their nation's founding, but aren't. This is a national story that belongs to them, that they can take pride in, and to which they should feel as if they belong. We owe them the chance to become part of it, and we fail them in writing our nation's history in such a way that makes them feel distant from it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Next, we have up as a team, Amity Shlaes. and William Pettinger.
Thank you, friends. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Robert, can you hear me? Oh,
Yes.
good. Just to be sure, my Coolidge Foundation colleague, William Pettinger, and I will divide our time with me making a few comments. And William, the final point, I did see a question that came in that I want to answer even before I talk, which is what books to read. I often recommend starting with primary sources, and I recommend the Annals of America, which is just primary sources. I always have it here, and for my period, that would be volume 15. No, my period that we are honored to cover, Williams and mine, is the 1930s. No period is more controversial than the 1930s, and that is because the federal government's intervention in the 30s under both Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt set the stage for all subsequent intervention. It's no accident, for example, that President Biden hung a picture of President Roosevelt and a large one by Frank Salisbury in the Oval Office, and not a picture of Calvin Coolidge. The 1930s interventions justify current interventions. In fact, the New Deal, Roosevelt's large program, his showcase, serves as a kind of justification, the justification that justifies all other events. It justifies stimuli, the New Deal, it justifies regulation, it justifies class warfare, increased taxation, prosecution, whether by Democrat or Republican. If you look at the current political spectrum, you could say there's not enough difference between Democrat and Republican. We are all New Dealers now. But for emulation of 1930s policy to be warranted, a certain narrative must hold true. That's the narrative you hear a lot, and is fairly well known. One, the 20s were a mendacious decade with pretend growth, ephemeral as a bubble in Jay Gatsby's champagne glass. The fault lay with market fundamentalism of Coolidge and Hoover's soullessness and obsession with mammon. Come the 30s, America paid for its 1920s sins. I just want to ask you to forgive me because I see I have a power problem. I apologize for that all of a sudden. 1920s and 30s sins with the Great Depression, retributive justice. Okay, I'm very embarrassed about this, but my camera has to lean for a moment because of power. Can you see me now? Is that all right? No, here. Sorry, gentlemen. I don't know what to do. Wait, hold on. Here we go. Can you see me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I can't see you.
It's a little angled. But
Yeah, I'm sorry. Cancel. There we go. It's going to have to be a little angle, and I apologize because of the power.
William, why don't you go on ahead and go, and then we'll bring in.
Yeah, I guess to continue on from what Ms. Shlaes was talking about, that in the 1930s period, there's just this common narrative that is accepted as almost the gospel truth in what, oh, Amity's back.
I'm back.
All right.
Oh, that's all right. I'll just hold it like this. You can see me just fine. And I apologize. It was all set up for 2 hours. Anyway, the general narrative is that the fault lay with market fundamentalism in Coolidge and Hoover. In the 30s, we paid for that, and that's why the Depression was so bad. Just recently, for example, Yale's Robert Schiller argued on TV that it was Coolidge's fault that the Great Depression occurred. Therefore, a double-digit period of unemployment was absolutely inevitable. 10 years, that was the Great Depression. And we're told that the New Deal, which was the antidote, you can't see me now? Can you not see me? William?
Yes.
We can.
Yeah.
We can.
Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
you're fine.
We
I
can
got
see
it. Which was the antidote, saved us from going communist as Russia did. This narrative doesn't hold up. example everyone does learn. The most common US history book about the 20s is actually an English class, The Great Gatsby. That's where kids get their narrative about what happened in the 20s, and they presume that the crash in The Great Gatsby was the crash of 29. It wasn't. The Great Gatsby was published in 25. So it's hardly a narrative of what could have happened in the 1920s. Another example, Hoover is presented as, just like Coolidge, a free marketeer. He was not. Actually, Herbert Hoover resembled Roosevelt more than Coolidge in a number of ways, vilifying business, raising the cost of labor, and so on. Overall, the data suggests, indeed confirm, that the 20s were a good decade, the 30s were a bad decade, and this idea of sort of post 20s, ergo Coolidge, is just a falsehood. In the 30s, the record is such that we can see that the government made the situation worse, to put it in a long story short. I really like the argument of Benjamin Anderson of the Chase Bank, who said the problem in the 1930s, what made the Great Depression, was the government's decision to play God. And then when it failed, to play God more vigorously. So the best move would be for new textbooks, and I count on that for secondary school and new curricula, to tell the story absolutely fairly. Unfortunately, the books we're reviewing don't do that. They kind of work around or roll over the basic and undeniable facts. There's no need for fervor here, just as Bertrand Russell said, because the facts are there and they speak for themselves. The 20s did see powerful growth. The books neglect that. In covering the 1930s, the books have a critical omission, which is the private sector. Again, they treated as something to be beaten up. If you want to have a litmus test for the 1930s coverage in a text, look what they do with the Tennessee Valley Authority, which really was a challenge to the private sector, not an augmenter to it, a business threat in the public choice sense. In the 30s, the New Deal really hurt the private sector and prevented it from taking us to recovery as it otherwise might have done and had done in the many other recoveries. That's a very important story, and you just don't see it in these books. These books also omit, by and large, something else. That is the struggle of individuals and the role of the human spirit. This is what Coolidge called things of the spirit, including the church. One story that I cover in my own work that I would like to see others cover, because it struck me so central to the period, was the rise of Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous was a self-help group which changed the lives of Americans in a more fundamental way than even rural electrification. And yet it's always treated as a sort of joke if it's ever discussed in that period. And finally, I'd like to add one last comment, which relates to what Bruce said, actually. The best textbooks don't stamp young minds or demand fealty. They invite inquiry. And that's why I like what Bruce calls the conservative imagination and also the liberal imagination. I do not consider the faults in the books that we are covering liberal faults. I consider them illiberal, smug, as we've been putting it, closed-minded. And I do think an optimal text or curriculum is being developed will be traditionally liberal, that is open, leaving students to make up their own mind. We should take great pains not to switch from progressive smugness to Tory smugness. That would not be an improvement. Stop there and apologize for my disruption and let William continue.
All right, thank you, Ms. Shlaes, and thank you to David Randall and the National Association of Scholars for inviting us to speak today. I hope to keep my comments brief so that we can have more time for questions, but there is an important point to be made about narratives in textbooks. Talking about the facts that were left out of these textbooks begs the question, why should these facts have been included and other facts excluded? These discussions often boil down to petty negotiations over the inclusion or exclusion of individual stories, which become a sort of way to confer honors or rectify past wrongs. People describe this as the need to feel seen or feel represented today. For example, inclusions of sidebars and additional sections and even whole chapters now detailing Native American and African American history in various periods have become mandatory to point that they must avoid accusations of erasing this or that group's ethnic history. However, this tit for tat debate ignores the importance of the narrative in textbooks. In the author's mind, virtue signaling supplants attention for narrative, but narrative matters. Any history textbook should be trying to convey to students a series of lessons, not just facts, and good lessons tell a story or narrative. Proper history is an inquiry for the truth, after all. This is the original meaning of the word history. And in this inquiry, a narrative is an important tool. In fact, this need for a narrative seems to be written into our minds themselves. When presented with a series of facts, we naturally try and fit them together to get some sort of takeaway or lesson, even when they're as disorganized as they are in textbooks today. The order, tone, and details of facts presented impact each other and form a whole that is made much more than the sum of its parts through its narrative form. To borrow someone else's phrase, you may not have noticed, but your brain did. An example of this can be seen in film, where this is referred to as the Kuleshov effect. For example, if you take a scene of an old man smiling and then play a scene of children playing in a playground immediately afterwards, the viewer naturally thinks of the old man as a grandfatherly figure. However, if you swap out that second scene of children playing at the playground with a scene of a young woman strolling down the street, the old man can appear as some kind of predator. This interrelatedness is not limited to visual media. It dates much further back, of course, in print media, and even before we had writing. For neither the Iliad nor the Odyssey, of course, were composed with writing. All this elaboration demonstrates that our dispute over whether to include or exclude certain facts is more than just a partisan squabble. The narrative form is one of the most important means by which a history textbook conveys truth. For example, The Unfinished Nation features a relatively lengthy description of leftist politics during the Depression era. Yet the text even admits that leftist influence on American politics was extremely limited during the period, at least domestically. Including a section on the history of the Popular Front may be inclusive, but it amounts to a romanticization of communism, despite the fact that it is being practiced in real time around the globe. Given the minor status of these leftist groups, this is such a disproportionate weight that it distorts the truth, even though the individual facts themselves are true, and especially in the absence of counterfacts detailing the horrors committed by the American Communist Party's paymaster, the Soviet Union. In addition, the absence of strong narratives in these textbooks leaves a vacuum in the students' classroom education itself. The vacuum can, of course, be easily filled by a competent teacher. However, this is not an ideal solution. This is not to be an attack or a slight at teachers as teachers. I'm sure that everyone can think of several teachers in their lives who are industrious and care deeply for their students. Nevertheless, we know that not every teacher is as informed or as rigorous or as honest as we would like. Thus, with weak textbooks, students may not have that safety net that a good teacher represents to catch them when they do not properly learn from the assigned course material. Strengthening that first line of defense, the textbook, would help significantly to counteract weak classroom instruction. To sum up, to be brief, the push to nuance American history textbooks by inserting masses of unnecessary facts has bloated and warped any attempt at a cohesive narrative history. Narratives matter and they make textbooks readable. Why do we expect students to read books that no one would willingly choose to read? There's a reason that no adult would ever choose to read a high school textbook to learn about American history. And students need better textbooks. Strengthening the narrative in textbooks would be a significant step in the right direction to making textbooks better in today's America.
Thank you so much, William. We now turn in our program to the commenters on the reports. First up, Jamie Gass. Jamie?
Great, thanks so much. I'd like to begin by thanking Peter Wood, Dave Randall, Stanley Kurtz, Ted Rebarber, and NAS for their excellent work on history and civics. And I'd like to congratulate them for assembling such an impressive and distinguished group of scholars for this superb report. Almost 30 years or so ago, I began my work in K-12 education, working for the Boston University Chelsea Partnership. And one of the things we did was review textbooks. I'm sort of saddened to read, although not terribly surprised, how much things haven't changed that much. But if we're going to exit this current crisis in K-12 history and civics, it's going to be through the efforts of folks like NAS and Catherine Gorka at Heritage. I also think it's important to acknowledge the excellent work of Gilbert Sewell, who for many decades fought the good fight in evaluating and advocating for higher quality traditional history textbooks. Going back to the 1980s, Gil warned us where the left's tyranny of isms would lead us. In our state constitutions, the framers made clear that K-12 education is the proper jurisdiction of states, localities, and parents. Adams and Jefferson and others made clear that the fundamental function of K-12 education was to inculcate the basic knowledge and history of civics for Republican citizenship. To that end, my comments are seen through the lens of 30 years in working in K-12 education policy in Massachusetts, the state that most acknowledge as the highest performing state on virtually every form of K-12 performance. But I do think it's also worth noting that the larger decline of knowledge and history in the last 30 or 40 years has also seemed to track along with the decline of public education itself. Truth be told, many reformers point to the 1983 A Nation at Risk report as a key touchstone for education reform policy, but the reality of it is that much of that report was focused on economic competitiveness, not on civic life or teaching history. In fact, many of the national commentators, whether on the left and the right, have largely wanted to use K-12 education decline for national fixes, including national standards and a strong emphasis on workforce development. In fact, if you had to summarize the central problem of the last 30 or 40 years in American education, it might be put on the lap of viewing K-12 education primarily as workforce development. We're sort of seeing that now morph into something else where schooling is increasingly being viewed as a laboratory for left-wing action civics or dumbed down video game civics. But these kinds of fads are doing enormous damage, as our commentators have mentioned, and that is reflected in the textbooks themselves. That's why I think that Skewed History makes such a valuable contribution to better understanding and diagnosing the troubles. So Massachusetts, where I live and work, is a cautionary tale. There's a lot to be proud of. There's an enormous accomplishment that has been achieved over the last 30 years. We had a 1993 ed reform law that was bipartisan in nature. It was, of course, state-driven, and it has led to the Commonwealth being the envy of the country in K-12 performance. The leadership, the political leadership, that is people like Bill Weld and Bill Bulger and Tom Birmingham and Mark Roosevelt, themselves were all product of a strong liberal arts background. That was the outlook that they brought to their political leadership around K-12 education. This was a significant departure from the workforce development or a politically correct centric model of education that had done so much damage. And essentially what they did is they coupled together highly progressive, generous state funding with a liberal arts centric, high stakes testing, teacher testing, and school choice driven view of education. But even as landmark as that legislation was, within a couple of years, it was becoming clearer and clearer that the state bureaucrats in Massachusetts had no intention whatsoever of implementing ed reform the way these political leaders articulated. Early versions of the English standards included Ebonics. The early history standards were really an example or an anti-model of what political correct history looks like. This really outraged the political leadership, so much so that they totally reconstituted the State Board of Education, the oldest board of education in the country. They put people like John Silber, president of Boston University, Ed Delatra, who had been the president of St. John's College, the great book school, Abby Thernstrom, and others on the Board of Ed to right the ship. One of the big lessons from Massachusetts, and I think it's one of the things that policymakers and folks on this call should remember, is that seemingly mundane appointments to state boards of education can have an enormous impact on what is taught in the classroom and the quality of ed reform. One of the other really remarkable sort of strokes of genius that this group of leaders brought together was to bring Sandra Stotsky, who for my money is the best respected, highest quality K-12 standards expert in the country over the last 30 years. And she oversaw the development of all of the standards, the English, math, science, history standards in Massachusetts. But the history ones were really the most contentious. And one of the reasons why they were the most contentious was what Sandy did was, unlike virtually every other pass at standards or curriculum development in recent decades, she brought accomplished academics and content experts to the table, a table that had been long dominated by educrats and frankly left-wing special interest groups. This is how we got the high quality English, math, science, and history standards in Massachusetts. It was really the careful work and management of the standards development by Sandra within the Department of Education. In truth, I'm not sure how she was able to do it because it's such a Herculean task. Even to this day, the culture within the State Department of Education is so unbelievably hostile to academic quality and knowledge that it just gives you a very clear sense that what she went through was almost a decade of trench warfare. But that kind of work is really what is necessary to get good standards. But again, there was no area that was more contentious, even among the reformers, even among the high quality academics that were brought to bear on the Board of Ed, than history. So much so that even after the standards were developed and even after the high stakes testing were developed and it was just about to go online, the Patrick administration and Governor Deval Patrick, really at the behest of the teachers' unions and the bureaucrats within the Department of Education, shelved the standards, shelved the test, and then really tried to open up the standards for revisions or along the lines of what they called 21st century skills, as well as cross-cultural competence. Then a year later, the Obama administration's race to the top pushed forward Common Core, which stripped the classic literature, poetry, and drama that Sandy had put in the English standards and had aligned those with the history standards. This is well documented and well discussed, but it was very clear that the bureaucrats within the State Department of Education, coupled with the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., had a desire to return back to a kind of utilitarian workforce development view of education with a thin veneer of academic content put across it. Under Common Core, unfortunately, Massachusetts is still number one on the nation's report card. But we've also seen dramatic decline in student achievement. That's true of most of the high-performing states, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Connecticut, and others, and increasingly in Common Core. And to really understand what is going on in the current discussions around civics and history, you have to see it within is shaped by the efforts of 10 years ago around the Common Core. What this has really led to, and the data is very clear, Ted Rebarber and others have done an excellent job of mapping out the data on it. It's really led to a lost decade of student achievement in high-performing states and in 2/3 of the states. So, what Massachusetts accomplished was remarkable. We did all of the right things. We had the funding, we had the political leadership. It was state-driven. We had high academic standards. We had high stakes testing connected to it. And yet the bureaucrats still found a way to subvert this. And I think what you realize is how deeply invested people in K-12 education are in these fads. And Common Core was one of them. We've seen in recent years the social emotional learning. But the one that is most relevant to our conversation today is this push for the EAD, or the Educating American Democracy, which is being driven by a handful of players here in Massachusetts. And what Pioneer Institute, where I work, has tried to do is we've done, going back 10 years, we've done polling, we've done op-eds, and we did numerous events on every major phase of American history, featuring scholars like Gordon Wood and James McPherson, David Kennedy, Taylor Branch, and Applebaum, trying to remind the state how it is that it got these standards, the importance of academic content, and the importance of high quality history in classroom. But the fundamental problem is, I think, in K-12 education is that most people in K-12 education, and I think it's particularly true in history, are incredibly hostile to the idea of knowledge itself. That to me is the fundamental issue. It plays itself out, I think, in the most dramatic way, because it's really impossible to teach history without knowledge, although that is really what it is you're seeing now, is that they try to use action civics, or they'll use video game civics and all these other gimmicks, really to push what the folks who have written this report have made clear is also present in the textbooks, which is to have a overtly left-wing bias that education is not an area in which the freedom of inquiry or the free exchange of ideas is valued, but in a way true to this workforce development outlook, that they're really training people to have a particular point of view. And in a very negative way, in 2018, this coalition of Massachusetts folks led by iCivics, Generation Citizen, and others who are now leading the EAD roadmap, they really did took out the hammer and tongs and did an enormous amount of damage to the Massachusetts history and civic standards, so much so that even in our really high performing charter schools, ones that serve largely poor and minority students, it's not uncommon at this point to see that the major history textbooks that are taught are the kids' version of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. I also see this every week in my daughter's state mandated 8th grade civics classes. This impact of the iCivics, video games, the highly ideological bias of this work is clear. It's made evident in just the lead up to the past election, where much of the discussion was really focused on partisan politics and having children have a particularly partisan view of the election. Long conversations about ditching the Electoral College, reducing the voting age to 16. All of this is done with kids that virtually have no background knowledge and very little basic understanding of civics. So to wrap up, I would say that there is a way out of this. And I think Wilfred McClay's book, Land of Hope, is simply the best US history textbook that I've seen in the last 30 years. Last summer, my wife and I read it to our two daughters, ages 14 and 9, who enjoyed it very much because it was so different from so much of what else they've seen in their social studies classrooms. It was not chock-a-block full of unnecessary graphics, but was really a cohesive, coherent narrative that gave them an additional background knowledge that's necessary to understand the country. And it was complementary to the other biographies, primary sources, speeches that we had already shown our daughters. So again, I think that if we're going to push back on this sort of dumbed down vision of history that's being offered by this educating American democracy and its advocates, then I think that it is going to be Wilfred McClay's book. And I think it's going to be a curriculum that's aligned with that I believe will have a very strong appeal with parents all over the country. When I was working on the Common Core, one of the things that was really heartening to me is that in most places it was parents and moms in particular that had a very firm grasp of what was going on. They understood the agenda. They sometimes understood the agenda much better than the people that were the policymakers, the people in government. And I do think that if children are given access to these kind of high quality textbooks like Wilfred has so carefully crafted, and that others are working as we speak to develop a curriculum for, I do think that it can really play a productive and constructive role in helping children understand the ideals on which our civilization is based on and help combat the efforts to tear it down. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Our second commenter is Catherine Gorka of the Heritage Foundation.
Hi all, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to our scholars and to NAS for putting this study together. We absolutely need tools like this to fight back. So substance-wise, I actually have nothing to add. I think the scholars have done an absolutely tremendous job of pointing out the problems and shortcomings with these texts. What I'd like to say very briefly is, what do I think that we need to do so that a study like this can be really impactful? So part of what's shaping my thinking is an email I received recently from an 11th grader who's written a long letter to her history teacher. This is a girl who was really excited about her US history course and then found herself in class with a teacher who decided to focus instead on Jeff Bezos and why the fact that he's made so much money is a problem. Then he focused on the insulting names of baseball teams, which use the names of Native American tribes. And he talked about pop songs and why pop songs show our inherent racism. So here's somebody who's really grappling with the problem and trying to figure out, what does she say to her professor, who's obviously locked into this progressive mindset that she wants to learn instead about the Constitution and America's founding and a true history. So I think, first of all, one of the tools that we need to be thinking about is, and I would say this is maybe the one addition I could see to this study, and I think it's there in parts, but it could be pulled out and highlighted. Why is the teaching of history itself so important? And toward that, I would just highlight for people, this is something that we at Heritage felt was really important. And so we commissioned Wilfred McClay to write an essay, and he knocked it out of the park. He wrote an absolutely incredible essay, which is coming out in the spring issue of City Journal, called Civic Education Rightly Understood. And I commend this to everyone. It's an absolutely beautiful essay, and I think it's got some really surprising elements. The focus is civics, but it also touches on history. But we need more of this. I think we have to be able to articulate the argument why students have to understand history. Second point I would make is the importance of supplemental material. I was glad that Jamie mentioned Gilbert Sewell, whose early work along these lines was so important and so foundational. But in a conversation I had with him recently, he pointed out that he thinks textbooks only make up about 40% of the content that teachers are teaching, and the rest is supplemental material. In a lot of ways, supplemental material allows teachers to make an end run around textbooks. So if you think these textbooks are bad, take a look at the supplemental material that they're using, whether it's the 1619 project, the Black Lives Matter curriculum. So I think we need to address this issue. It's a major, major concern. Lastly, I just would stress that I think when we come up with content like this analysis, which is so important, we have to translate it into terms or arguments that parents, especially parents, but even students can use to push back on their teachers. Because honestly, you know, for a while, I thought that parents were the key to fixing this. But I've actually, especially after seeing this recent email from this 11th grader, I have hope in our students. I really do. And I think with this lockdown, especially, I was talking with our son yesterday who's been locked down on his university campus. And we said to him, you know, do you think this has at least given you a healthy respect for small government? And he said, actually, what it's really taught him is the problem when people have too much power. And I think that we have to hold on to that hope that students through this lockdown have had reinstilled in them the importance of freedom and of just power being in the hands of people. So I think our role as scholars, as leaders of nonprofits who are fighting this fight, we need to always be thinking, what are the tools that we can put into the hands of students to fight this fight? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Now our third and final commenter, Stanley Kurtz.
Thanks so much, Bob. Well, our country is going through a period of crisis. I think we've heard intimations to that effect already from some of the speakers. I think probably everyone listening to this has some sense of that. It's an endemic crisis. It seems to be getting worse year by year. And what is that crisis? Of course, we're divided into two camps. And those camps aren't quite the same as the camps represented by our ordinary political divisions. Instead, we have a more traditionalist camp that is gathered around the fundamental underlying assumptions of classical liberalism that inform our constitutional system, and for a long time, and to some degree still today, are embraced by both parties. On the other hand, another camp is developing that increasingly nowadays we call woke, is motivated by assumptions, underlying assumptions that are out of the boundaries of our constitutional system and the liberal principles it's grounded on. We talk about critical race theory today, which is grounded in critical theory, which is a form of neo-Marxism, which goes back to Marx. And you could track this dichotomy with what Amity Shlaes said, essentially about liberal, meaning embracing both parties and related to our constitutional system, versus illiberal. And I think that the report we're looking at today is telling us a huge part of the story of why this division is happening. And it's usually a hidden part of the story. Certainly people will say in passing, oh yes, the schools have gone bad and the textbooks are part of that. Although that really wasn't taken seriously until recently. We've had almost an odd sort of graph of this where with Bill Bennett and Lynn Cheney under Reagan and the first Bush, there was a real attention to the culture war over education. And then people started to roll their eyes and consider the academy irrelevant. And then all of a sudden, as the ideas on the campus start seeping into society, people take it more seriously. So the textbooks are the hidden part of that story. Now, of course, we hear about Howard Zinn and the 1619 Project, but they really are not the most important part of the story. I don't want to say they're meaningless, far from it, but they're bookends in a sense. Zinn's radicalism influenced the historians who wrote these textbooks. And the 1619 Project, in a way, embodies what has been produced since then. But you think back, have you ever read a review of a textbook, of a history textbook? It almost never happens. And it's not hard to understand why. Who would want to review? Who would be able to review? Even today, our panelists have not reviewed the entirety of a 1,000 word or 1,500 page textbook. It requires too much expertise, and people don't have the patience for it. And yet this is what is really moving the country, or a big part of what is moving the country into the situation we're in. And this has been going on, as has already been said today, for really a quarter of a century and more, depending on how you count it. For example, in some of the reports, we get references to the idea of three worlds meet, or the Atlantic world, meaning that the textbooks now, instead of beginning with a focus on the European settlement story, go on about Africa for some time and have very extended treatments of pre-Columbian American civilization, and only then get to the European settler story. That all goes back to the National History Standards debates of 1994 and 1995, where this three worlds meet idea originated. It was condemned 99-1 by the US Senate. By the way, the one vote in dissent dissented not because it didn't want to condemn the standards, but because it wanted penalties instead of just symbolic condemnation. And yet those standards were embraced by teachers across the country. And so we're now dealing with the results of 25 years of these textbooks. And what I want to do here is just touch on sort of a big picture context for some of this. So, for example, a number of the individual essays in the report say that, give a kind of proximate explanation to the effect that we're looking at fashionable fads, fashionable scholarly fads that are distracting students from the real story. Or we're looking at an author who is somewhat self-indulgently focusing on his narrow specialty, dealing with American Indians, when that's not what the students should be learning. And that's all true. I completely agree. But why are those fads in the first place? And I don't think I'm saying anything here that is surprising our authors. I think they're just keeping to their limited task of focusing on the textbook. But if you look at the both the material that went into the College Board's framing of the AP US history curriculum and into the material behind academic history in general, you see that everything in these texts was meant, that is being complained about in these reports, is meant entirely intentionally. It isn't just a question of self-indulgence. The College Board deliberately expanded the treatment of pre-Columbian civilization, and did so, I believe, and I've written about this at some length, in order to distract people from the central story. And you can read historians speaking about this. They do it in their own language. They say that we're trying to deconstruct the dominant narrative. Deconstruct the dominant narrative. And what you've been hearing from today are the few remaining historians who still think there's some significance to the so-called dominant narrative. The deconstructors don't want students to follow that narrative, and they've hit upon various techniques. They are hostile, and this is all open if you read their material, their theoretical material about what history is supposed to do. They are overtly hostile to the idea of the nation. They are hostile to the project of the founding. They are hostile to religion. I don't want to be overly flip. I take all of this very seriously, but honestly, if you just play out or sing out for yourself John Lennon's Imagine, you will have their program. And as you read this report, think of John Lennon's Imagine. No nations, no religion, That's what this report is really about. So what we're looking at here, and this has been hinted at, but I want to emphasize it, is not simply differences that develop from the inevitable difficult choices that any historian is faced with on what to focus on. You choose your focus, it's something of importance, and inevitably something is left out. That's not what's going on here for the most part, although that's always an element of what goes on. No, we're dealing with a kind of suppression here, and it's ironic. Going back to the dispute over the AP US history standards, there were critics, including very much the National Association of Scholars and myself, and among conservatives in particular, there was a lot of attention to criticism of the College Board's revised AP US history standards, and there was no coverage of this in the mainstream press, none. But conservatives were highly aware of it, and there was a relatively conservative school board elected in Jefferson County, Colorado. And so they made moves to restrict or demote the AP US history curriculum. And the left-leaning teachers union then, in a way that Jamie Gass, I think, has already suggested, manipulated the students and got the students to start demonstrating against the school board, arguing that American history, the school board was trying to censor American history, suppress and censor American history by cutting out all of the nasty things that had been done. When in fact, if you read this report, you will see how much the current point of view, in fact, censors, leaves out, and very intentionally so. And you can go back to the original dispute. This goes back a long way and was repeated continuously. If you go back to 1987 and the dispute over Western civilization at Stanford, you'll find that when it was suggested that there ought to be more attention to the history of African Americans and women and other groups, actually the traditionalists said, yes, let's do it. Let's include more of that material. And the left rejected this out of hand. I should say the multicultural left, and said, oh no, that's not good enough. That's tokenism. No, what we need is a complete revamping of the story that is told. And so what you're reading in these textbooks and what you're reading in this report is what came out of that, the attempt to completely change the story, which involved very much so a kind of suppression. I'll give another example. Right now, there's a lot of debate over the 1619 project. I've just watched the debate on the floor of a state legislature and I've seen this quote going around. Students aren't learning about slavery, it is said. And they cite a survey that said some appallingly low number of students were able to cite slavery as an important background cause of the Civil War. Well, of course, you ask students about pretty much anything in history and you'll find an appallingly low number of students are able to get the right answer. But if you read these books, and I've looked at some of them myself, particularly America's History by Henrietta, it is both intelligent and appalling. So I agree with both assessments of it. It is intelligent and appalling. But if you read a book like Henrietta, and this was mentioned in the report, that he lingered over the most gruesome material about slavery, it is impossible to read these textbooks and think that students are not taught about slavery. And yet we're hearing that we must adopt the 1619 project because students are not being taught about slavery. It couldn't be more the opposite. And you're hearing in all these reports that identity politics is highlighted, and the fundamentals of our constitutional system and the unique contributions of America in breaking through on both abolition of slavery and Republican government are being ignored. And we're getting identity politics out the wazoo, basically, and yet we're still being told it's not being treated. And this report is an antidote to that and reveals that to be false. how is this bias encoded? We've seen a little bit of difference on this, and I think there's elements of truth in both. On the one hand, we don't have coherent narratives. We have kind of thrown together textbooks here, and they are careful at a certain level to try not to seem biased. So you don't get a coherent, clear progressive bias. Rather, you get roundabout backdoor strategies. So the focus on the Atlantic world really is a way of allowing a focus on the slave trade, which is really allowing a focus on colonial Virginia instead of the traditional focus of Massachusetts. And I don't disagree with when it was said earlier that colonial Virginia ought to be given its due. Of course, that's true, but that the Atlantic world narrative allows a diversion from the democratic and religious founding of Massachusetts to Virginia with a focus on the slave trade, with the underlying message that capitalism and slavery are connected and therefore evil. And so this is a backdoor way. And so in the New Deal chapter, we are given both sides of this message. On the one hand, we learn that with the exception of one of the books in particular, which does tell a pretty coherent, biased, progressive narrative, the other books tell an incoherent progressive narrative, you could say. They don't give you the whole 9 yards. They're too careful so that no one can point at them and say, well, you're obviously being very biased. But they leave out fundamental issues that might lead a student even to consider the fact that Roosevelt's reforms might actually have prolonged the New Deal rather than solved it. And in many other ways, as in all of the other sections and chapters, omissions combined with selected emphases lay down a groundwork such that when a liberal democratic politician comes and appeals to people based on a certain understanding of American history, everything clicks because the groundwork has been laid, even without an overt portrayal of only one narrative. This is something like what mainstream media news used to be like just before it became completely and overtly biased. There was a veneer of impartiality, but really there was a profound bias, partly from intention and partly because people didn't even know enough about the other point of view to represent it. So the report to me represents a rare and profoundly important window onto the sources of our dilemma. And I want to emphasize, and I'm biased here because I'm a strong supporter of American achievement testing, but I do believe that American achievement testing and Ted Rebarber's work with that, developing a curriculum built around Bill McClay's book, Wilfred McClay's Land of Hope. But not only that, built around consultation with other scholars, such as the ones here. In fact, I very much hope that AAT will take very seriously and drink deeply from this report, because I think this report is a treasure chest of suggestions on what to do and what not to do to create a real choice and real alternative for local school districts. And I think our real hope in all of this, because we have lost the education bureaucrats and the elite, our hope in this is parents. These are the people that Catherine Gorka are trying to organize. It's parents organized by people like Catherine Gorka who will be able to choose, perhaps even running candidates for school board in their local school districts, and have them choose a curriculum created by AAT, Wilfred McClay, Ted Rebarber. And that would have, by the way, really been a great help to Jefferson County, Colorado. Jefferson County was faced with this bogus critique of censorship. But what if AAT had existed and had this alternative curriculum crafted by respected and respectable scholars? Then instead of just saying negative things about the College Board's APUSH program, they could have said, hey, we're switching over to AAT. It would have been much harder to attack them for that. So AAT, I think, really represents the solution. And it's no coincidence that these both came out of the same NEH grant. And again, I would urge Ted Rebarber to drink deeply of this report and have it inform what AAT is doing. So I do think there's hope, and I do think there is a solution, but our dilemma is profound because for literally decades, this material has been pouring into the minds of our students, and barely anyone has, other than Gilbert Sewell and some parents who have a vague sense of what's going on. And so also hats off to the NAS for doing this. Quite honestly, I hope you'll somehow find a way to do it for every other period in American history. This is an invaluable guide to teachers who want an alternative. If we had this in combination with the positive approach of AAT, we would have the beginnings of a real turnaround. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stanley, for those excellent final remarks. As you might imagine, we have run over our allotted 90 minutes, so we don't have time for question and answer. But for those people who do have questions, I would encourage you to contact the National Association of Scholars, Randall at nas.org. I would also encourage people watching to contact not only the individual presenters here, but also the organizations represented by the folks who are a part of this webinar. I know the Alexander Hamilton Institute would welcome questions from parents on slavery, on Alexander Hamilton, on the founding. If we can't get you the answers, we will certainly do everything we can. So I can't thank the National Association of Scholars enough for preparing this webinar. History is one of the fundamental ways we know things. It is invaluable. I have, for example, pages of quotes by some of the great thinkers in the Western tradition as to why history is important. If anyone wants those, they are welcome to contact me. So David Randall, do you have any final remarks you'd like to make before we close it down?
Thank you. My thanks to everybody, all the authors, the panelists, to all of the commenters, to our wonderful moderator. I just want to say what the bit about wanting to do everything. We actually NAS has an idea to work on that. It, in fact, is one of the upcoming projects we want to do. And in fact, we thought of this as being the seed for a review and survey of the entire, frankly, every history textbook, certainly on the AP level, to do that sort of comprehensive work. So we got it planned, give it a while, but this is meant to be, the first work, not the last. Oh, and I guess I just want to say, and part of the point of history is the joy of the scholarship in itself. I do encourage you to read actually all the separate works of the scholars, their own works, all the panelists here. They all do wonderful work. And part of the point is not just to read a survey, it is to go beyond that to the wonderful stuff, all the other advanced stuff, specialized stuff that can be done. So please read everything done by everybody who's been participating in this. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, everybody. Please have a good day, and we wish you well. Stay healthy.